The New York School Literary Period by Jordan Myers. Summary of the period. The period took place throughout the 1950s through 1960s. It was a collection of artists that wrote poetry, painted, danced, and composed music during this time period. For the purpose of this presentation, I will be focusing specifically on the poetry, but all of the works in this period can be considered avant-garde, surrealist, experimental, abstract, or a work of expressionism. The poetry in this period, or movement, exhibits the style of stream of consciousness with a focus on imagery. This style is one in where the sentence structure of the poetry is similar to how thoughts would arise in the human mind. The movement is also active in the gay rights community, as many members of the movement were homosexual. Notable poets include John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, John Schulier, Barbara Guest, and Kenneth Koch. The first example of the New York School poetry that I have prepared is Song, I'm Stuck in Traffic, by Frank O'Hara. I am stuck in traffic, in a taxicab, which is typical, and not just of modern life. Mud clambers up the trellis of my nerves. Must lovers of Eros end up with Venus? Mus es sin, es muss nicht sin, I tell you. How I hate disease, it's like worrying. That comes true, and it simply must not be able to happen. In a world where you are possible, my love, nothing can go wrong for us. Tell me. The second poem I have prepared as an example is much different in style, but the surrealist nature can still be observed. It is The Idiot by John Ashbery. Oh, how this sullen, careless world, ignorant of me is. Those rocks, those homes, know not the touch of my flesh, nor is there one tree whose shade has known me for a friend. I've wandered the wide world over. No man I've known, no friendly beast, has come to put its nose into my hands. No maid has welcomed my face with a kiss. Yet once, as I took passage from Gibraltar to Cape Horn, I met some friendly mariners on the boat, and as we struggled to keep the ship from sinking, in a storm the very waves seemed friendly, and the sound the spray made as it hit the front of the boat. Both of these poems can be considered a reaction to confessional poetry, as is the entire movement of the New York School. The New York School poets would often parody confessional poetry, which was another movement going on at the same time, which would often use the personal pronoun I and explore many personal emotions. The first poem by Frank O'Hara can definitely be considered a reaction to confessional poetry, and I would also consider it a parody of it. The use of the personal pronoun I, as well as the inclusion of the narrator's thoughts and feelings, definitely mimics the style of confessional poetry. However, the stream of consciousness writing that the New York School style of writing adopts exposes the melodrama in the confessional writing style. Both of these poems can be considered experimental and break poetic norms that were established in the confessional poetry as well as other forms of poetry during this time period and the time periods before it. The New York School of poetry does not follow conventional rhyme structure because the poets wanted to challenge the established forms of poetry during the mid-1950s. From a social perspective, the New York School was similar to the Beat movement, as it was a counterculture that explored social topics such as homosexuality. The school would also reference popular culture, music, and movies of that time period. The counterculture nature of the New York School movement means that socially it was more progressive than the conservative time period that it resided in. And that brings us to how is this period representative of its time? The New York School establishes the counterculture thinking found in the beatnik and hippie movements around this area. However, the New York School was much more confined to a certain geographical location, New York. It included liberal-minded leftist thinkers that diverged from the conservative America of the time. This way of thinking was a smaller minority that would grow into the larger movements later on in history. The surrealist nature and experimentalism of the New York School marks it as an important transition between the rigid structure of the 40s and 50s that can be found in the social atmosphere of the country, as well as even the literary and poetic atmosphere. This transition would go into the counterculture that is so often associated with the 60s, and then later on to even more liberal thinking in modern times.